the Friends of the Library.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Our speaker, Frederick Golder, has a really distinguished background. He's taught labor, employment law, conflict resolution, trial practice, and alternative dispute resolution, and organizational behavior at Northeastern, Harvard Law School, and other top universities in the country. He counsels organizations in conflict resolution, problem solving, harassment prevention, diversity, organizational behavior, and group interaction, and has appeared on national radio and TV. And he's written extensively. We put the names of some of his other books up online. I did want to tell you, I'm sorry, I should have kept this for later. I sort of delved right into our speaker. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Friends. For some of you who don't know, we're an autonomous, not-for-profit group, and we're a bridge between the library staff and the board and the community. And we have sponsored all sorts of projects and programs to benefit patrons. And tonight's program, featuring Attorney Golder, is one of these programs. I just want to briefly introduce our board members that are here. Phyllis I, who is a membership and email chairman. David I, who's in charge of our book sales. Elena Lavalis, who is our vice president. Beverly Kaplan. Len Greenberg, whose picture isn't there, but Len is our treasurer. And Alexis, our newest board member. We're very pleased to welcome Alexis Montalban. So I think that's the only ones I see right now. But welcome to all of you, and welcome to Attorney Golder. And I'm going to turn this over to him. And tonight he is talking about his book, Reaching Common Ground.
Well, good evening, everybody. And I want to thank the library for inviting me, for Maria and Rena, to come and talk to you about something near and dear to my heart, which essentially is conflict resolution. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, a little bit about how I came to write the book, what is in the book, and what the book can do for you to help you navigate through life. So very briefly, before I became someone involved in conflict resolution, I did a lot of trial work. I was a civil rights lawyer for many, many years, tried a lot of cases. And then at some point in time, I had an epiphany and decided that resolving cases through trials were not really very effective. So I went into conflict resolution, I want to say about 30 years ago. And then I decided about 6 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe about the time when things started to get really nasty. People were not talking to each other. There were all sorts of things happening around 2015, 2016. And I started to do some research because I was wondering, why were some cases so easy to resolve and some cases almost impossible? Why were people easy to get along with and some people almost impossible? So I wanted to find out from a scientific perspective, why was this happening? So I looked at biology, I looked at genetics, I looked at psychology, personality, motivation, and I went to some of the leading experts in the field. Being in academics gave me an opportunity to contact some of the people that I had known over the years in different fields, and they were fantastic in providing this amazing information. And the information became my book, because after I gathered all this information, I said, I have to make a book. I have to share what I learned, things that I thought I knew, I didn't know. And I learned so much. And I want to share that with you. And I thank the library for allowing me to talk to you about what I learned. So the book itself consists of 3 parts. Part 1, the sources of conflict. Part 2, the types of conflicts that one gets involved in. And part 3, solutions. Everybody likes solutions, but I like the first part of the book because it helped me understand the nature of conflict and all of its aspects. So starting with the sources of conflict, and these are the sources of conflict: genetic differences, environmental differences. I'll stop right there just for a minute to talk about that, and we'll get to the other 5, the other 3. But every single person on the planet is genetically different. Even identical twins are genetically different in maybe a small way, or maybe more than a small way, but they're different. And these genetic differences actually impact on how we see the world. And we also have environmental differences. These are our life experiences growing up, and they're all different. Each one of us, every person on the planet is different. Genetic differences, environmental differences. And they make up who we become. Personality differences, all of the genetic differences and the environmental differences combine to make up our personalities. These are sources of conflict. Some people are easy to get along with, some people very difficult to get along with. We have different personalities. Some people are pessimistic, some people are optimistic, some people are introverted, some people are extroverted, in various different degrees. We all have biases, prejudices, and we do stereotyping. It's really part of our evolutionary makeup. We'll talk a little bit more about bias, prejudice, and stereotyping as we go along. And finally, the economic disparities that we have all over the planet and the power imbalances that exist. All of these things create sources of conflict. And sad to say that because we have this inability to learn to get along, to understand each other better, we're faced with conflicts. Sometimes they seem at sometimes insurmountable. But I'm hoping through teaching more about how and why we have these differences and why we have these conflicts, how we might find ways to work together to solve these problems that we have, because I know it's possible. I know we can do it. I want to talk a little bit about bias, stereotyping, and prejudice. And I did quite a bit of work representing women, people of color, people of different religious backgrounds, people with disabilities and impairments. I represented them, workers who were discriminated against based on people's biases, prejudices, and stereotyping. But I'm going to get to something even more important than the bias and prejudice and stereotyping that everybody does openly. I'm going to talk about something much more important. So what's a bias? Well, it's a preference in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another. Bias doesn't necessarily have to be an evil thing. For example, some people like steak, some people like fish, some people like vegetable. That's a bias. You have a bias in favor of something, a bias against something. It becomes what I like to say is invidious when the bias has no basis in fact, when it's based on stereotypical notions. And these stereotypical notions are really exaggerated beliefs, images, or distorted truths. And if we're filled with them, the news media, you turn on the television, you talk to someone, They stereotype. They have prejudices and stereotypes based upon what they've heard, what they've seen, what they've absorbed, what their life experiences has told them. And the stereotyping is not based on fact. It's based on distorted images. The sooner we learn that, the better we're all going to be. And finally, the last of the three, prejudice, which are preconceived opinions. That's what prejudice is. If you break it down, it's prejudging. So if you're prejudging, you're not really getting to know the person on the other side. You're prejudging. Their values may be different than yours. Their opinions, their customs, all of those things are going to be different than yours. No two people have the same opinions, values, customs. Even if you grow up in the same household, you're going to have differences. And we have to appreciate the differences. I like to say, we don't want to have conversations with people to judge them. We really want to have conversations to understand them, to learn more about them. And when you get into these learning conversations, we're going to get a little bit more into that later. But if you get into a learning conversation as opposed to a judging conversation, you're going to learn something. No one wants to be judged, but they do want to be understood. And you know how we understand people? We listen to them. These are the prejudices that I want to spend a little bit more time on, because these are the prejudices that we're not even aware of. None of us likes to think we have biases. Everybody likes to think that we treat people fairly, we treat people equitably, and we don't discriminate. But the truth is, every single one of us has hidden biases that we're not aware of. That's why they call them hidden biases. We don't know what they are. And we're going to spend a little, now, I'm not going to talk about every hidden bias that exists, because they've done studies, and there are many, many hidden biases that we have that impact on the way we make decisions. Give you a simple example. Assume you have a hidden bias and you think women are less capable than men. Not true, but if you have that bias, then you're going to look at a man and a woman differently because of that bias. Even though you think you're not going to treat the woman differently than the man, you are going to look at that woman differently than the man because of that hidden bias that you're not even consciously aware of. And you may be selecting people based on that hidden bias when you're making decisions. So, what are some of the hidden biases? I'm only going to talk about 8, because these are the hidden biases that have, in my opinion, a very significant impact on how we relate to each other. So everybody, I hope everybody out there, we're going to have some conversations later on in the talk, but I hope everybody knows about confirmation bias. The tendency to search for information or evidence consistent with one's belief. Now, the opposite of that, of course, is if it's consistent with our beliefs, we accept it, sometimes without question. If it doesn't confirm our belief, if it, in fact, if it challenges us, we avoid it. We tend to avoid it and not consider it. So we pay too much attention to things that we agree with and pay not enough attention to those things we don't agree with. Makes it difficult to us communicate with people who have different ideas than we do. The hindsight bias isn't quite as exciting, but we all have a tendency to exaggerate how much one could have predicted an event. So in 2016, nobody thought that Trump had a chance of winning the Republican nomination, right? That it was impossible until after he won. And then everybody said, oh, well, we knew he was going to win. And nobody thought he had a chance of winning the election in 2016. But after he won, more people said, yeah, well, I knew he was going to win after the fact. The hindsight bias. The third one I talk about very briefly is the self-serving attribution. And we always attribute more to the success of a project through your own efforts as opposed to somebody else. So whatever you do, you consider it to be more valid and more important than what somebody else does and what somebody else contributes to whatever the project is. Now, the illusory, that's where the stereotyping comes in. That's where the stereotyping comes in. We're not going to spend too much time on that one, but we'll spend a little time on that. The false consensus effect, which is a tendency to overestimate the extent to which others agree. So you might be having a conversation and the person is shaking their head while you're talking, and you get the idea that the person must be agreeing with you. After all, they're shaking their head up and down, so that must mean agreement. So you have a tendency to overestimate what impact you have on somebody else. And I can tell you this, from my own experience, maybe you folks have the same experiences, I can't change anybody's opinion. I can try, but I can't. People's opinions are formed by their life experiences, and their genes. So you can't change their opinions very easily. Very difficult to change somebody's opinion. So it's liberating for me because I know I can't change your opinion about anything, so I'm not even going to try, and I don't have to worry about it. So if you're in a relationship with someone and you're not going to change that person's opinion, you can learn to understand them better, and by understanding them better, you might have a better relationship, but you're not going to change their opinion. That's something they're going to keep. Just like you, no one's going to change your opinion, and you won't change anybody. That's how it works. Now, this is a dangerous one that we are in, I think, in some respects, the bandwagon effect. We have a tendency to follow other people rather than separate ourselves from them. So this bandwagon effect, a lot of times people might conform rather than derive the conclusions for themselves. I'm going to give you an example that you might know from history. Maybe you don't remember that history, but 1962, the Bay of Pigs. Everybody wanted to try to go and invade Cuba and get rid of Fidel Castro. And people may have had some idea about, maybe we ought to think about this a little more. But what happened was one person said, oh, sure. And then pretty soon you have a bandwagon effect and you don't have people saying no. And that's dangerous. So in any administration, in any organization, you need someone to be the gadfly, someone to say, well, I don't know, let's think about this. If you've seen the movie, the 12 Angry Men, if you remember that movie, that's a really interesting example because in the beginning, everybody wanted to convict the person who was accused of murdering his father, except one person was Henry Fonda. And he said, let's think about this. So you have a tendency to conform to what everybody else is thinking in time. Let's take a deep breath and say, we better stop and maybe change how we do that. The anchoring effect has a tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered. We call it the anchor when making decisions. And that's part of how we do things as humans. We have a tendency to rely on the first piece of information. We have to stop doing that, but it creeps up all the time. The curse of knowledge. And it's difficult when you know something and someone doesn't, it creates a hidden bias in how you communicate. Sometimes what you know, sometimes what you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. You know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. And that can be dangerous. Moving a little bit more on to the confirmation bias. And this is what the confirmation bias is all about. But I want to emphasize this one part of the confirmation bias. One effect of confirmation bias is that we ignore or refuse to listen to the other side. So we don't get all the information we need to make rational decisions, to help resolve conflicts and solve problems. That's what the confirmation bias, in my opinion, is the most dangerous. We have to have the willingness to listen to people we do not agree with. That's the only way we're going to learn. The hindsight bias, I'm going to just talk about that briefly and move on a little bit, but this is an interesting statistic. Before Clarence Thomas was confirmed, 58% of the people predicted he'd be confirmed. After the vote, the same people, it was 78%. The hindsight bias has a tendency to get us to think we know more than we know. Everybody is a Monday morning quarterback. And our memory gets distorted from the hindsight bias. I knew it would happen. It had to happen. I said it would happen. Now, we get to, I think, one of the most important parts of working with other people, solving problems, resolving conflicts, active listening. We spend a little bit more time on active listening. And active listening is listening to understand, not listening to judge. And very oftentimes, if you're listening to judge, you're thinking about what you're going to say next, and you're not learning what the person is saying. And active listening is essential to conflict resolution. So to put it simply, you want to be aware, you want to be listening, and you want to be engaged. I know I'm talking a lot. I never learn anything when I talk. I only learn things when I listen. So the key in developing empathy, building trust, is to speak less and listen more. And you want to listen with a non-judgmental ear. And really, it's all about gaining trust and all about empathy. Now, all the things I'm talking about here tonight, I can tell you, if I spend a great deal of time in my book describing all of this in much more detail. I mean, I can't take a 300-page book and put it all in an hour, a 40-minute talk, but I'm trying to give you the essence of what I'm talking about. And that is, if you read, understand, and use what I have learned, and I didn't know this stuff until I started to do the research 6 or 7 years ago, but I can tell you that it works. If you want to use it, it works. Read it, understand it, and use it, and you will have more opportunities of resolving conflicts and maintaining positive relationships with people you love. It's tough though, but it works. It doesn't work unless you use it. I can promise you that. But when you use it, it will work and it will make your life better. It has for me. Okay. We get to the 6 steps for resolving conflicts. And you think, well, it's kind of simple, right? Well, you first have to identify it. What's the conflict all about? And it sounds simple, but it's essential to find out what is it that what are you arguing about? What's this conflict? How many parts are there to it? What are you trying to solve? So you've got to identify what it is first. And the second step, you have to create a positive environment. If you're feeling down, if you're not feeling well, if you're angry, if you're in a bad mood, you can't get into resolving conflicts when you're emotionally distraught. So you have to create a positive environment. And the third, I think, is probably one of the most important parts of conflict resolution. Don't think about it as his problem or your problem. It's an us. This is not you or me. This is a problem we have to solve jointly. We work together to solve the problem. We're not pointing fingers. We're not blaming or judging. We're not criticizing. We're looking upon this as a joint problem. We can work together and solve it. And the fourth, we want to focus on needs rather than positions. Everybody takes a position. Well, I want this, I want that. What you want to do is start thinking about what is it that I really need? What is it that I want, as opposed to what my position is? Every single position that a person has in any negotiation or any conflict, there's always hidden underneath that position a need that the party has or an issue that has to be resolved underneath the position. There was an interesting conflict that occurred involving a company overseas that would refuse to let the other party have an exclusive on this particular product. And he couldn't understand why he wouldn't let him have this exclusive, because he came and they had a good deal. And he found out the reason that he wasn't willing to give him the exclusive was he was selling some of the product to his cousin. So once he realized that that was the reason that he was stuck in his position of not giving him an exclusive, he said, oh, well, okay, here's what we're going to do. We will carve out an exception. Your cousin can have all of the product he wants, but I will then have an exclusive on everything, on the product that I want bringing into this country. So both sides were satisfied because their needs were met. And the fifth, and this is something really critically important, which is creating options that'll satisfy the needs of both parties. And when I get involved in options and creating options, I try to be as creative as I can, because it doesn't matter how many options you create, the more the better. And eventually, if you keep creating these options without judging which one is better or worse, at some point in time, you're going to hit on an option that may satisfy the needs of both parties in an optimal way. And finally, you want to use objective standards, right? If the house is worth $500,000, you're not going to be selling it for $1 million. So how do you judge that standard? What's the market value? The market value for a house of that type, $500,000. So when you're talking about $1 million as opposed to 500,000, you're not using an objective standard. That's the sixth part. Now, as an added bonus, from my book, I developed a concept called TREAT. That's an anagram. treat conflict. So what's treat conflict? This is my little piece here. The first thing you have to do in order to solve conflicts, you have to build trust. Sometimes it's the most difficult thing to do. It's hard to gain and so easy to lose. So what are the elements of trust? And these are generally the rule. This is what I have found in all the times I've been doing this mediation for over 30 years now. Reliability, sincerity, integrity, consistency, commitment, and competence. When the other side, when both sides, when I'm doing the mediation, when both sides have all of these elements, that's how trust gets built. And it's really the first part of any conflict. Really, you've got to build trust between the parties. Secondly, the second part, respect. You may not agree with the person on the other side of the table, but you want to respect the other side. It's very important to respect one another without necessarily agreeing. You have to respect each other. And the third part of treat is empathy. And when people realize that you have empathy, they know that you're understanding other people's feelings, and they know that you're working toward a resolution. Empathy. Great stuff. It works. All the stuff I'm talking about, folks, works. And finally, not finally, but next is acknowledgement. People like to be acknowledged and valued. Nobody likes to be denigrated. Nobody likes to be judged. They like to be acknowledged. We acknowledge, we know, we see you, you're a person. We acknowledge you. And last, tolerance. So what's that? We have to learn to appreciate and understand feelings, habits, beliefs that are different from our own. I don't have to accept or agree, but I have, in order for me to be able to listen with an open ear, I have to be tolerant of your views, not agreeing with your views necessarily, but if the other side sees that you're tolerant of their views and you're not judging and you're not denigrating, you're in a much better place to find common ground, to reach common ground. So I'm going to stop now and I'm going to open it up for questions. So Maria, you're going to take the questions. You can do it in the chat, or I guess you want to raise your hand.